Hi, I'm Patrick Murray, Director of the Monmouth University Polling Institute. Those of you who were here a couple weeks ago for our event with Monica Crowley, and so we were trying to offer equal time here to both sides. So we're going to start. Let me give a brief introduction for Steve, for those of you who don't know him that well. If many of you who have been around New Jersey politics do remember his tenure here, his cutting his teeth period as a political reporter for what was then called Politics NJ, now Politicker NJ. Also, he was co-host with Jim McQueenie of News 12's Power and Politics, which is one of the first shows that I appeared on as an up-and-coming pollster. I was working at Eagleton at the time, so now the tables are turned because I'll be interviewing Steve tonight rather than vice versa. I actually learned a lot from talking with Steve and being interviewed by Steve, both for the TV show and for Politicker. Steve is a font of bizarre trivia knowledge about politics. And I'll read, he writes, he's the senior political writer for Salon.com right now, and so I'll read one of his pieces, and it'll be something else. I totally forgot that the plane was on the tarmac waiting for Mario Cuomo to fly up to New Hampshire. And he pulls this out of the recesses of his mind somehow. He's a native of Massachusetts, so he's very happy with the score of the game tonight. And for those of you, it was 6-1 I saw on the way down here. Does anybody have an update, Nick? Nick, you just gave up, didn't you, on the game? And he's now host of MSNBC's The Cycle, which is, they call it their ensemble show. It's 3 o'clock a weekday afternoon. It's 4 young hosts, kind of give the young person's view, the young voter, the young whatever, the young pundit's view of the world. And it's a fascinating show. I've had the opportunity to watch it a few times since, I'm supposed to be at work at 3 o'clock, but
that's what we're there for.
Yeah, so I do get to catch it. But I want to welcome Steve Kornacki and thank him for being here tonight.
Thanks. Thanks.
Steve, I just want to start off. We now have 2 presidential debates under our belt, but the first one is the one that everybody really focused on because it did have an absolute sea change on the dynamic of this very close race. So let me ask you the first question as an MSNBC person. Based on that first debate, does Barack Obama really want to be president for another 4 years?
Yeah, no, I was, I remember watching Barack Obama in 2008 have 35 debates with Hillary Clinton and John Edwards and Joe Biden and Chris Dodd. And I don't know if there was a single one of those debates that I thought Barack Obama had won. I remember the 3 fall debates with John McCain, and I think Obama was serviceable. The election by that point was basically his to lose. McCain is not the most charismatic communicator. Obama was fine, but certainly not dazzling. I don't think he's a very good debater. So my expectations for his performance weren't that high for Denver. And I think Romney, especially as of a month ago, was underrated as a communicator, specifically as a communicator of scripted messages. They can give him a script ahead of time, a bunch of data points to tick off, a bunch of anecdotes to sort of lean on, and he can really deliver it with confidence and sort of with assertiveness. He can be very glib. I think Romney gets in trouble when he gets off his script, when he gets a little rattled, when somebody asks him a follow-up question he doesn't understand or he didn't expect, or interrupts him. That's when, for instance, if you can remember in the Republican debates, Rick Perry did that. He did a $10,000 bet with Rick Perry, or tried to do a $10,000 bet. He'll say something like that. So my expectations were I thought Romney was going to do better than expected, and I thought Obama was going to struggle, but I didn't see that coming. That was the only parallel I can think of historically. A little bit with Bush and Kerry in 2004, where Bush really didn't show up for the first one and Kerry impressed people and he cut the gap. But the other one that jumped out at me, and it's a different climate, but was Reagan and Mondale in 1984. And that, if you forget it now, because Reagan won in a landslide, but they showed up for the first debate, and Reagan was forgetful, and he was doddering, and he just was all over the place. And there was a wide consensus. I went back the other day and found it to remind myself. There was a poll after that debate that said by a 68-19 margin, people thought Mondale had won it. And I saw I think the result for this one was about the same. Yeah, that was truly surprising to me. And yeah, it's had obviously a lasting impact so far.
So obviously, regardless of what happens, Obama is not going to win in a landslide like Reagan in 1984. But do you think that the second debate turned the tide backward?
I'll give you a really firm answer here. I don't know. But what I'm looking for, and I think we're going to have a good sense in the next few days, and the question that I'm asking is, I think there are basically two ways to look at and to understand what's happened in the last few weeks after Denver. One is, if your view of this race is that the economy is not doing well and swing voters are inclined to throw President Obama out. They're basically looking for an excuse to vote him out, sort of like they would have been looking for an excuse to vote out George Bush Sr. in 1992 or Jimmy Carter in 1980. If that's your view of the race, then you could draw a scenario where the entire year Mitt Romney was such a bad candidate, self-destructive candidate, whether it was the Republican convention, which was completely botched, that world tour he had this summer where he just stepped on his own message. He became the public enemy #1 in England. Took him forever to get through the Republican primaries, had to move very far to the right, all this stuff. Had a terrible September. There's a very basic threshold. If you accept that people are looking for an excuse to get rid of Obama, there's a very basic threshold that the challenger has to meet. Just basically competent, reassuring, and not somebody who's associated with any really inflammatory positions, inflammatory rhetoric. And you could make an argument that Mitt Romney simply failed to meet that extremely basic threshold all year. And that's why, from April until the start of October, when they had that first debate, you could look at Real Clear Politics does this, a website. There's a couple others that will do it too. But they'll do an average of every public poll. And they'll do a daily running average. Today, the average of all the polls is Obama 48, Romney 45, whatever. That was remarkably steady from April until the end of September. And Obama was basically always ahead between 1 point, 4 points, 5 points, somewhere in that range. Romney never led that entire time. So you could make an argument that in that first debate, for the first time for a mass audience, he reached that competence threshold. And if that's all it takes, then I don't think this second debate's going to change much, because I think Barack Obama performed better in the second debate, much better, infinitely better than he did in the first debate. But if people at this point want to know that the alternative is competent, I think Romney held his own in the second debate. And the polls afterwards suggest that. Obama's judged the winner of the debate, but the margin's not 70-20, the margin's 45-38, something like that. So that's the other way of looking at it, however, is maybe the reason that Obama was ahead from April to the end of September is that the average swing voter is inclined to reelect him. They like him personally. They understand the very unique, historical situation that he kind of walked into as president with the economy in free fall. They understand that the other party was more responsible than his for that mess, and they're willing to cut him a little slack. And at the same time, they don't have the highest opinion of the Republican Party. If you look at how the two parties, the sort of the favorable ratings of each party, the Democrats aren't overwhelmingly popular, but the Republicans are a lot more unpopular than the Democrats. So maybe it was for all those months, people were inclined to reelect Obama. That's why he was ahead. And what they saw in Denver was so jarring and so unsettling to them that for the first time they took a step away from him. If that's your interpretation of it, and it's perfectly possible, then I think the performance he turned in this week will bring those people back. So it's all a very long way of saying, I'm really interested in what the polls say between now and Monday night. If there's movement back in Obama's direction, I don't think we've seen enough right now to tell us anything. But I'm really curious what that's going to show.
Well, do you think it's just competence, Romney's competence, that people were looking at?
Well, I think he came across. I think that the basic, just a lot of this is so. It's about style points and stuff, unfortunately. But I think a lot of it is he did convey sort of a plausibility about being president. I think people looked at the guy in that debate and probably felt like, yeah, this is a guy with a certain level of command, and I could kind of picture this guy being president. But the other thing is, again, if we're talking about voters being inclined to vote Obama out and kind of looking for reasons to do that. Romney gave them a lot of them. And this isn't true in the second debate as well. The statistic that jumped out at me in the Insta polls after the second debate wasn't that Obama won the debate. It was which candidate won on the question of the economy. And the CBS poll was 65-34 Romney.
Right.
And the CNN poll, I think, was 48-30 Romney. And Obama is just, I think, it has been in a very difficult position because it's tough for him to run on, I've turned things around, because people don't feel he's turned things around, even if there are some hopeful indicators, even if things are unquestionably better. There's a lot of room for Romney to argue that, this isn't what a real recovery looks like. But at the same time, I think Obama then runs into trying to introduce context into it. Well, things aren't as great as they should be right now, and it's because we were losing all these jobs at the start of the presidency. It's because the complete economy completely melted down at the end of 2008, and we've been trying to clean up from that. And oh, by the way, there's been really unprecedented legislative obstruction from the opposition party. That could be very difficult to sell for a whole bunch of reasons. I think Romney's message on that front is just, look, when the economy melts down and it takes a long time to crawl out of that, there's going to be a lot of scary sounding statistics about 47 million Americans being on food stamps, about 1 in 6 being in poverty, about 23 million being out of work. Until last month, about the longest sustained period of 8% plus unemployment since the Great Depression. Romney has this just arsenal of statistics that he can tick off, and I think if people aren't broadly feeling better about, really better about where the country is, Romney can really tap into their anxieties, I think, very easily, and I think
I think the anxiety is the key here, because there's my take on it is a little different. Is not competence, but actually comfort level with Mitt Romney as an alternative. The devil that you don't know. Are you comfortable enough with the unknown? That's what I thought happened in the first debate, was that he made people comfortable, because the whole Obama campaign had been that either you don't know what this guy stands for, or what he stands for is going to hurt you. The little that we do know of him is going to hurt you, so the rest of it probably will hurt you too. And my sense was from the first debate that people felt more comfortable with Mitt Romney, that he wasn't going to hurt me.
Yeah. Yes, and that also, I was surprised that the Obama people, and I think Democrats in general, were surprised by the Romney who showed up at that first debate, because I come, as Patrick said, I come from Massachusetts. I've seen this guy in earlier versions of Romney, and he is not. I think the Obama campaign and a lot of Democrats looked at the positions Romney took in the primaries and thought, that's going to be the guy who shows up at this debate. He's going to be forced to read from this what's become a very far-right Republican policy script, and there's going to be all these openings for Obama to jump in. And even if Obama doesn't jump in, everybody's going to hear this, and there's no way Romney can sell this. And Romney just basically decided to ignore the policies and just talk about very reasonable sounding outcomes and assert that whatever policy I put in place on, however I structure my tax plan, it's going to balance the budget, it's going to cut your taxes, it's going to grow the economy. That's wonderful. Pre-existing conditions, you have nothing to worry about. He just made these assertions, but he did them in a very glib and confident way. And I think, I think it's just a reality. A lot of voters, casual voters, do not pay close attention to everyday politics. It's not, they lead busy lives. Obama at that point is depending on context, depending upon people having looked at Romney's plan on their own and realizing, wait a minute, that's not what his plan on pre-existing conditions does, and most people just don't do that. So I think he was able to sell this very reasonable, reassuring, moderate image in that debate really well. And I'm surprised the Democrats were surprised he did that, because he's good at that. He's done that before.
Well, then let me ask you this question: what do you think a Romney presidency would look like?
I think the Romney presidency would be extremely conservative. I don't think the Romney presidency would be about Mitt Romney. The Romney presidency would be about the Republican Party. I think, what's the best way to understand this? Just look at how the Republican Party has responded to the Obama presidency and what the sort of emergence of the Tea Party and this sort of very conservative activism that we've seen over the last few years, what that really represents. To me, it represents two things. One is what the Republican Party tends to do when the Democrats win elections. I mean, they were relentless in their opposition to Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Now we look back and everybody likes to talk about these good old days of the Clinton presidency when we all got along. You know, they impeached Bill Clinton, among other things. I remember Jesse Helms, senator from North Carolina in the 1990s, saying, you know, Bill Clinton better not come to my state. Somebody might put a bullet in his back. United States senator saying this about the president. I mean, these were the good old 90s when the Republicans and Bill Clinton worked things out. I mean, so there's part of it is that's how the Republicans behave when a Democrat wins a national election. But the other part of it is there's been this sort of internal cleansing in the Republican Party. They had to explain to themselves how a guy like Obama, who they are telling their base, and I guess they believe themselves, is this, you know, radical socialist. How did somebody like that become president in the first place? This country would never do that, right? And I think what they have convinced themselves is that it's because George W. Bush, with Medicare prescription drug, with No Child Left Behind, you know, with sort of the domestic programs, the domestic agenda that he had, adopted this sort of bastardized form of big government conservatism that gave conservatism a bad name, that caused people to associate the economic, you know, collapse with the Republican Party, with conservatism, and that made people vulnerable to the, you know, allure of Obama and all of his magical charms. So they take that reading of how Obama became president, and then he said, well, the solution is, for this to never happen again, we need to be totally committed to our principles. So they moved farther to the right, I think, than they've ever been on economic policy, on social policy, on just about anything. So it's the meeting point of obstructing Obama's agenda and cleansing their own ranks. And what we have seen for the last few years is one Republican primary after another, whether it's for House races, for Senate races, for gubernatorial races, candidates who have strayed, incumbents who have strayed, candidates who have strayed from that sort of conservative purity, that pure conservative ideology, have been punished. They've been punished in humiliating, in sort of unprecedented ways. Delaware, 2010, Michael Castle, long-serving, moderate Republican congressman, runs for the United States Senate. Small state, everybody knows him. He loses to Christine O'Donnell in a primary. He voted for TARP and a couple other things, but I mean, you know, this was the big crime. They would rather nominate Christine O'Donnell and lose that race than nominate Mike Castle. You know, we saw this. Sharon Angle became the candidate in Nevada, if you remember her. People started winning these primaries who you never would have seen win one of these things before. Earlier this year in Indiana, you know, Dick Lugar loses to this guy Richard Murdoch, came out of nowhere. And so what that has done is it's made the Republican Party, first of all, guys like Richard Murdoch getting elected to office, that makes the Republican Party in Washington or wherever that much more conservative. But second of all, it has a chilling effect, I think, on anybody in the Republican Party in office who has pragmatic or moderate instincts. If you want to see a preview of the Romney presidency, look at how John Boehner has behaved as Speaker of the House. Because I think John Boehner, in a lot of ways, is similar to Mitt Romney. At his core, I mean, he has a history in politics, and you can look back at him, look back at his career and say, this guy actually has been a pragmatist in many ways until about 3 or 4 years ago. But he is now the leader of the House Republicans. The House Republicans are kind of gripped by that mentality that I just described. And so John Boehner, he's not a leader. He's the guy who happens to have the leadership position, but he's led by them. And early on in 2011, he's the new speaker, and the conservatives in his party want the Paul Ryan Medicare plan. They want to rally around this and make this their own. John Boehner and a lot of the people close to him recognized right away this is not politically a good idea to be running on voucherizing Medicare, especially if we're going to pass this and it's going to die in the Senate, and that's going to be that. But he had no choice. He couldn't stop them. A stronger leader in a different situation would say, well, that's crazy. Well, we're never going to bring that bill up. But Boehner had no choice but to bring it up, and every Republican except for 5 or 6 in the House had no choice but to vote for it. So it's all a long way of saying I expect if Romney is president, it's going to be the same. His role in the Republican Party is to sign whatever that House and that Senate pass.
So he's going to be the CEO of America. Get the other people to do the work.
Yeah.
Other people will do the work, and you get the credit for it.
Yeah, or the blame. I don't,
But what do you think another 4 years of Obama's presidency would look like?
That's That's a wild card,
Well, that's interesting,
and that's part of
since he's already been president.
And that's part of the, and that's part of the reason why I think that's part of the reason why he's struggling a little bit. There are a couple things. I mean, one is, first of all, the act of re-electing him, even if he doesn't do anything proactive in his second term, has the effect of preserving what he achieved in his first term. Healthcare reform can be wiped away if he's not re-elected. You know, Wall Street reform, Dodd-Frank, whatever you think of it, can be wiped away if he's not re-elected. So there's a lot of the first 2 years of his presidency were actually very productive. I think this was the most productive period in Congress since LBJ and the Great Society. Simply preserving that progress would be, I think, would be an achievement of a second Obama term. But then the question to me becomes, the first major issue to confront whoever wins this election is this whole thing of the fiscal cliff. And you've got, a series of tax cuts that are expiring at the end of the year. You've got automatic spending cuts, particularly on defense, that are scheduled to kick in. And now the defense industry and all of its allies are we can't abide these cuts. My question is, and I do not know the answer to this, if Obama's reelected, will we get the Obama we had when Republicans first won the House in 2010 and in 2011, when he pursued this grand bargain with John Boehner, this comprehensive long-term debt deal where the Democrats are going to be willing to put on the table some kind of cut or reform in Medicare or Social Security, social safety net programs. In exchange, they're somehow going to get compromise from Republicans on revenue, that's a whole other issue. I don't see how they're really going to get more revenue out of Republicans. But is that where what he decides to pursue? Is it, Tim Geithner is stepping down as Treasury Secretary. Does that mean Erskine Bowles becomes Treasury Secretary and they go back to this grand bargain approach? Or is there sort of a liberation and the direction is much more, if you can think of where he was when he gave up on the grand bargain, when the grand bargain blew up, the next thing he did was he introduced last fall the American Jobs Act, which was basically stimulus 2, which was basically saying the number one problem facing this country right now is not deficits. The number one problem facing this country is there's no demand in the economy, and we need to use the government to stimulate demand right now. And so the American Jobs Act was, heavy relief to the states, rehiring of teachers, preservation of teacher jobs, construction jobs, this sort of thing. Does he turn around and say something like that's going to be my priority now? That kind of economic philosophy, and I don't think anybody has a really good read on what that's going to be. And it's in that debate the other night. I think a lot of commentators point out, he didn't really say this is what a second term is going to be like. And it's pretty glaring to me. He introduced this bill, the American Jobs Act, last year, in part to show what he believed and what he wanted to do, but in part to highlight Republican obstructionism. And so it was meant as sort of a campaign tool, and he hasn't used it in his campaign. He has not been out there talking about, I have this plan, they've obstructed it, I'm now coming to you, John and Jane American. It's up to you to stand with me and deliver a message to the Republicans that this is what you want our country to be doing, this is what this election's about. He hasn't done anything like that, and so it's left me confused where he would go.
Well, I feel the same way as somebody outside trying to figure out, what the strategy is behind a campaign. And I feel that the Obama campaign has missed a lot of opportunities to try to paint these distinctions or say that this is what we tried. Who is he going after? What segment of the electorate is he going after with whatever strategy he's using?
I mean, the most obvious one that they've been going after all year is women, and to a degree that all this micro-targeting in the electorate now, where you can identify, there's not just women, it's married women. It's not just married women, it's married church-going women with 2 children, and you can keep breaking down the electorate in all these different subgroups. But the one group that I've really seen, women. What's the term here? There's this Ron Brownstein, who's on CNN a lot. He writes for National Journal. He writes a lot about basically demographic data and politics. And he says that what Obama has been trying to cultivate is the coalition of the ascendant. These are demographic groups that are sort of rising in their influence, in their presence in American life. College-educated women, for instance, Hispanics, Latinos, African Americans. The idea being he is trying to cultivate such high support in these sort of emerging, growing demographic groups in a way that if you had had the same breakdown a generation ago when the demographics of the country were different, you wouldn't win the election. But today he could have a lower share of the overall white vote, but win the election based on having Latinos, based on having women, based on having high turnout among blacks, that sort of thing. So they've concentrated on a kind of completely different coalition, and I think they've looked at this traditional. You always look at these sort of. Traditionally, we always look at these sort of blue-collar white voters as the key pivotal swing voters, and I don't think that's loomed as large in the Obama calculus.
I hear a lot of the punditry looking at some groups. Remember early on in the campaign, they're talking about the Catholic voter. Right, and the Catholic voter is the swing voter, the determined voter, but it's not true. It's because the Catholic voting bloc, they're not a bloc. The group of Catholic voters are entirely diverse. That's why they reflect the outcome is just because they're diverse, not because they vote as Catholics necessarily. But the thing that I see in this race, and talking about the women vote, is that the issues of, say, abortion, Planned Parenthood, which is clearly a key issue. I've been asked about this recently because of my polling numbers. We've seen the advantage for Obama among women voters shrink. Saw that in the Gallup poll. We've seen it in a lot of other polls. And they said, well, because of the first debate, these moderate women have moved away. Are they going to come back because of this issue, this Planned Parenthood? I said, that's not why they moved. They didn't move because of Planned Parenthood. They moved because of the economic issues, their comfort level with Mitt Romney on their kids' schools and being able to feed their kids and all those other things. The abortion Planned Parenthood issue is a base issue, which is the thing that you were talking about, is that this seems to be the strategy on both sides in this race, which is to build up your base and haven't been appealing to the middle, the swing voter. It's like, let's keep the swing voter at home and just count on the people that we can count on. And my impression has been that this election has been much more of an appeal to the base and literally keeping turnout low, because you just want your base to turn out and you want to keep out any moderates who might swing the other way, away from the polls. Do you feel that that's true?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think there is a pretty good parallel that can be drawn to 2004. It's a sort of mirror image. I think this year is sort of a mirror image of what we saw in 2004. It was holding up a lot better until about a week or two ago. But in 2004, you had George W. Bush, obviously the incumbent president, being challenged by a flip-flopper from Massachusetts with some sort of wealth image issues. So you had that basic similarity. But you look at that, Bush's approval rating, you can track it now, week to week. At this point in 2004, syncs up with basically exactly where Obama's approval rating currently is, and that now works basically the whole year. Bush was basically as popular, as endangered in 2004 as Obama has been this year. In 2004, the big sort of source of the polarization. And it was, what did you think of his prosecution of, what did you think of the Iraq War? What did you think of basically his response to 9/11? This year, obviously, it's much more domestic. It's about the economy, but I think it's equally polarized. It was holding up extremely well. Kerry fell behind in September, just like Mitt Romney fell behind in September this year. Kerry got much closer after the first debate, but he never caught Bush in the polling average. He was behind through October. Now we have Romney actually pulling ahead of Obama, so I'm starting to say maybe this is breaking a little different way. But I think it's very similar in that minds were made up very early in that race. There was a very small pool of voters who actually could be swayed, and it was a lot more, you think about appeals to the base. 2004 was the year that, Republicans got a lot of these anti-gay marriage, ballot initiatives put on state ballots across the country, the idea being to increase turnout of social conservatives, the conservative base, and then while they're out voting against gay marriage, they'll vote for Bush. That being the idea, at least. I actually don't know if that worked at all. I've heard people say they think that did it. I'm kind of skeptical, but that was the nature of the thinking in 2004 a lot, and I think we're seeing that this year.
I forget whether it was Nate Cohn or Harry Anton or one of those, or probably somebody else, who looked at the swings in the polling averages after debates, before and after debates. And prior to this year, I think the biggest single debate swing was maybe 3 points. Now we saw 4 to 5 points with the first debate this year, so that's unheard of. One of the things that I thought has shaken this race up is that they were counting on a base vote. They weren't counting on this volatility. They were counting on having people locked in and really fighting on the margins. But a 4 or 5 point swing means that maybe 10% of the electorate is still up for grabs, still movable, of the potential electorate, people who could still show up and vote. That's a high number for a presidential race at this stage of the game. So how do both campaigns kind of change their strategy now that it's no longer the driving down that moderate vote and putting your base out?
Well, and it's tough right now too, and this is, so we have one debate left, and theoretically this is the final great opportunity for each candidate to change the race in a fundamental way. But of course, the one debate that's coming up is designated as the foreign policy debate. Yes, foreign policy is extremely important. There'll be important issues discussed. I wonder if the fact that it's a foreign policy debate is going to depress the audience for it. But more to the point, I don't think the issues that are likely to move voters in measurable ways are going to be discussed at this debate. And so I'm almost looking at this now and saying we're a couple of weeks away, and outside of this debate and outside of any kind of a major unexpected world event or something, I don't see what's out there that can really change the dynamic of this thing, which is why I keep saying I'm so always interested to see how these polls shake out after a debate, but I'm particularly interested after this one because I really saw this one as the last obvious opportunity for Obama. He needed it more than Romney at that point, for Obama to really change the way the race was looking on domestic issues. And I don't know what he can do. We have advertising that I assume the advertising, I always assume the advertising will basically be a wash at the presidential level. I don't think we're just going to, there could be a slight disparity. One party can have more money than the other, but I think there's so much free information out there. People know these candidates. I don't think the advertising is going to matter that much. We talk about the ground game, and maybe there's some advantage there, for Democrats that anything could matter in an extremely close race. But in terms of in speeches, I don't think they're really going to be moving people. So I don't see what else there is on the horizon that's gonna shake this up again.
So this is ground game in 8 states that we're talking about, 8 to 10 states.
Yeah.
So this is the original strategy, which was going to be that ground game, and the Obama campaign felt that they could win that ground game, which is, we look historically, that's unusual. That the Democrats feel that they can win a comparatively low turnout ground game base election, and it looks like they're going to do well in Ohio, particularly with the early vote and the early voting decision.
I talked to a number of Democrats who expressed the view of I'm worried about where the national polls are right now and where they're trending, but then I look at Ohio and I feel better. And my response has been, don't. Look at Wisconsin, because there's all sorts of different scenarios here, but here's the way I'm looking at the electoral map right now. Romney has to have Florida, so let's just say he gets Florida. He has to have Virginia, let's say he gets Virginia, and he has to have Colorado, let's say he gets Colorado. I mean, he may not take any of those states, but to have a chance, he has to win those. Okay, give him those states in North Carolina. Give him those states, and he has 257 electoral votes, and you got to get to 270. Now, if you take Ohio on top of that, done, you're there, that's 18. But if you lose Ohio, you still have options. And the most reasonable path at that point is win Wisconsin, which is 10, and then win one of New Hampshire. There's a poll there yesterday that has it dead even. Nevada, nobody can figure out what's going out there with polling, but that's a plausibly winnable state for Republicans. Or Iowa. Obama's been ahead in Iowa, but not by an overwhelming margin, and it's Iowa. It has a Republican governor, all these things. And I think Wisconsin is a much riper target for Republicans for a couple of reasons. One is that it's Paul Ryan's home state, and they always say vice presidential candidates have no effect on the outcome, which is basically true. But I think they found
not when it comes down to 1 point.
Right. There's a straw. There could be 1 or 2 points in the home state. Yeah. So that's a great state to have the 1 or 2 point edge in right now if you're Romney. The second thing about Wisconsin, though, is it had one of the most dramatic swings in the country between 2004, Bush and Kerry, and 2008, Obama-McCain. It was won by a fraction of a point by John Kerry in 2004. It was won by 14 points by Barack Obama in 2008. And that's the national thing did not move that dramatically. This was huge. Several other states had similarly dramatic shifts. North Carolina comes to mind. The difference is, in a state like North Carolina, that result was attributed to demographic factors. There was sky-high turnout of African-American voters, for instance, in 2008 that hadn't quite been there in 2004. There's changing demographics. North Carolina, is a state in flux, so especially like the Research Triangle area is becoming more like the North, all these things. Wisconsin is a much more stable population state, so it's a lot more jarring to have that kind of a swing there. And it's a swing among, I was saying they don't matter as much, but it was a swing among blue-collar white voters, blue-collar and middle-class white voters who went from Bush on national security issues in 2004 to turning on him and embracing Obama in very big numbers in 2008. And then if you look at Wisconsin since then, in 2010, bring in the Republican governor. In 2010, throw out Russ Feingold, the senator, replace him with a Republican. You have a majority Republican House delegation from that state right now. And then this year, you had the failed recall of Scott Walker. And so all of that is the product of those voters who switched from Bush to Obama in 2008, going back to Republicans in 2010, staying with Scott Walker this year. And so I think there's a larger pool of available swing voters in Wisconsin than in most states. They're tailor-made for Romney in the economic message. He's got Paul Ryan on the ticket with him. And the other thing, again, I was saying the ground game, here's a state where Republicans spent the last year and a half, 2 years fortifying themselves for this recall this year. So if there's one state, if I'm a Republican and there's one state where I'm feeling good about what I have in terms of a ground game, it's Wisconsin. So if you're Romney and you get those other things to break your way and you get Wisconsin, suddenly I would like his odds at that point of picking off one of those other three small states and winning, even if he loses Ohio.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I don't even think he has to win Virginia, because I think if he wins Iowa, he could be winning Nevada as well. And then New Hampshire and Wisconsin. Then you've got it even without Virginia. Right. But the thing that you said, and a lot of people are saying is, okay, we'll give Florida to Romney. And I think we're overlooking, from a strategic point of view, I think we're overlooking that. But if you don't give Florida to Romney, he can't win.
Yes.
So what's going on in Florida?
Well, there's now been, for the first time in the last few weeks, we've seen Romney take the lead in polls there. So there's that. There have been, if you look at the television advertising expenditures, there's been a shift. Nobody knows quite what to make of it. There's been a shift by the Obama campaign a little bit away from Florida and from Virginia and from North Carolina and toward these more sort of Rust Belt states. And there's apparently been, Florida's a weird state because when you talk about the Latino vote nationally, you talk about Obama having an overwhelming advantage, close to 50 points. Florida's the one exception to this, and it's largely because of the Cuban population. They're a very large Cuban population that's historically pro-Republican, but that, I think, the most recent polling has shown has really gone strongly in Romney's direction since the Denver debate. He was always closer among Latinos in Florida than anywhere else. But it's a single-digit spread there now among Latinos, and it's attributed apparently to a significant rise in support in the Cuban community there. It's an impossible state to figure because it's like 8 different states thrown into one. So it's just there's this Tampa Bay, Orlando area. There's South Florida, there's the New York refugees. There's they call it the Redneck Riviera. All of these things. It's an impossible state to figure out. But no, you're right. I mean, mathematically. If Obama can find a way to pick that off, there's no Romney presidency. Yeah,
I've polled Florida for the Republican primary, and it was interesting. I remember that that shifted in the last week.
Was this
from the polls?
2010 when it was.
No. I'm talking about this year's presidential. This year's presidential primary. You remember the polls were out then, and then within a week the polls totally shifted.
Right.
And one of the things, that I noticed from polling it is that the Cuban population in Miami is extremely difficult to poll accurately. So I'm not sure whether these polls that we're seeing are accurate, one way or the other. And Romney could be up bigger, but he could also be down by a lot. I mean, this is really a difficult population
Well,
as a whole.
and I mean, so much of the advantage that Obama has, I think, on with Latino voters is comes from the immigration issue. It comes from it's not just he did the executive order this year that basically sort of made part of the DREAM Act a fact on the ground basically. The effect of that really was to sort of thwart an opening for Romney to get to the middle on that issue. But the polling I've seen of the Cuban population in Florida, in South Florida, is that immigration, they have very different attitudes on immigration than you're going to find among Latino voters in other states. And so sort of the source of Obama's huge advantage nationally doesn't apply there.
Yeah. Well, let me ask, we mentioned these building of coalitions here, or groups in the ascendancy. And what did Lindsey Graham say? There's not enough.
Old white guys or something.
Old white guys are dying off. There's not enough.
Right.
We give them up. One of the things that I notice in the polling is the huge advantage for Obama among Latino voters.
Right.
Put the Cuban vote in Miami aside, among the rest of the Latino voters in the country. And this is a group that is growing most dramatically among all the voting blocs that there are here. Is there a danger that the Republicans could lose them permanently, at least permanently within the next generation, just like they can't get the African American vote?
Yeah, I've been wondering about that, and I've been trying to figure that out because you're right. I mean, they can't. They're a party now that can't. It celebrates if they can get 10% of the black vote, and if that happens, anything like that happens with the Latino vote, they are screwed, long term. The margin in 2008, Obama, to give you a sense of the evolution of this, I guess, in his presidency, George W. Bush and Karl Rove, Karl Rove had this idea of the permanent Republican majority, and a big part of the permanent Republican majority was Latino voters. He saw that as a source of the future for the Republican Party, and Bush really cultivated them. Symbolically, rhetorically, and then ultimately policy-wise. He pursued comprehensive immigration reform and got, creamed on it. But in 2004 against John Kerry, the Latino vote was 53% for Kerry and 44% for Bush, and that was a very good showing for Republicans with the Latino vote. By 2008, when Bush had tried and failed with comprehensive immigration reform, and when the Republican Party had really kind of asserted itself as on immigration almost a nativist party. The margin, and this was when McCain, by the way, at the top of the ticket, McCain, who had been helping Bush on immigration reform at the beginning, ended up basically renouncing it during his campaign. But so Obama beat McCain among Latinos 67-31. So he'd been 9 points in 2004 and exploded to 36 in 2008. And if you look at the polling this year, I saw one the other day. I think it said like 68-29. Yeah, it hasn't moved, and this is. I thought that if the Republicans lost this year, and if the Republicans do lose this year, and you can look at the Latino vote, I don't know, in Colorado or Nevada, wherever it ends up being, if you can make the case as a Republican that we would have won the White House if we had just gotten 35% of the Latino vote instead of 20% of it or whatever. My thought earlier this year was they would move on changing their tone on immigration as soon as this election was over. They would move to the middle on immigration. There would always be the sort of Steve Kings, this congressman from Iowa who's very, very anti-immigration. There would always be voices like that, but there'd be a real, the leadership of the party would really assert itself and they would get cover. You'd have Jeb Bush, you'd have Marco Rubio, you'd have Chris Christie, and they would make this a point of, this is where we need to be, this is where we're going on this. But first of all, if they win this election, I'm not sure they're going to feel any, they won't feel any immediate incentive to do that. And if they lose this election, I think we got a preview of what was going to happen a month ago, because a month ago, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, Romney was consistently losing in all the polls, and the consensus, even among Republicans, I think, was that he was going to lose the election. And what we were hearing was the conclusion of Republicans seemed to be, well, this should be a totally winnable election for us. Mitt Romney is blowing what should be our election. And he's blowing it because, well, he's a bad candidate, he's mistake prone, he's all these things, but he's blowing it because he's not conservative enough. And you heard all these calls for like, Paul Ryan should be the guy, out there with our message. We need Paul Ryan, not Mitt Romney, and all this. So if they lost the election, I just think it's a repeat of what happened in 2008. They told themselves in 2008 they lost because they weren't conservative enough. If they lose again in 2012, I think they take the same lesson. And if that's the mindset then, and if this fear of primary challenges that I was talking about earlier persists, there's going to be no leadership in the party to move on immigration, and nobody is going to feel safe stepping out because if you're a congressman and you just come out and say, oh yeah, I think we need to move to the middle on immigration because it's for our future, you're going to get a primary challenge and you're going to lose. So I can't imagine, I almost can't imagine a scenario where the Republican Party 15 or 20 years from now has committed electoral suicide like that, but at the same time, I'm having a hard time seeing how they get away from that happening. I can't see it right now.
All right, we're going to open up to questions in a minute, and there are going to be people, our polling institute staff are going to be around with microphones, so if you want to ask Steve a question, raise your hand and they'll get to you. And right before we get to that, I have one more question for you, which is different topic slightly, is what do you think of our guy here in Jersey?
I think if Chris Christie had decided to run for president last year, he'd be on his way to the White House right now. And I think he probably knows that. He's probably told himself that a few times. But it was, I was telling Patrick earlier, I was telling a few other people, I covered New Jersey. My first job out of college, 2002, I got down here to 2005. Chris Christie was the U.S. attorney back then, and he was, it was pretty clearly, one of his thoughts with having that job was that he could use it as a springboard to become governor someday. And he was prosecuting all these high-profile political corruption cases, getting great headlines, great press, and he's very good at cultivating the media. And I was 23 years old, fresh out of college. I was working for this website that didn't have that much money and wasn't paying me much of it. And basically living on a couch with a couple pairs of clothes. And I would get these emails from Chris Christie, the U.S. attorney, who was basically kissing up to me. It wasn't me. I was his conduit to get to the website that I wrote for, which was read by all the political people in New Jersey. And he wanted to have favorable treatment from the website. And I was watching this last year, at Salon and MSNBC, and everybody's trying to figure out, is Christie going to run? He's not going to run. And I was like, I wish I had saved those emails because that's, he's not sending me those anymore. So
similar story. When he was still attorney, and this was just a few years before he was running, then the year or two running up to it, is that I would run across him. He was here a few times as a speaker and elsewhere, and he would be very friendly. He'd introduce his staff to me and say, hey, pay attention to this guy or whatever. And then as soon as he got into office, we had polls out, which of course things weren't going so great in New Jersey then. It wasn't quite the same.
Wait, what did he say?
Well, said I had to go back to school, which of course I've never left school, so I don't know. But that's fine. We have a different point of view on what polling should do. But does anybody out there have a question? Liz.
I have Rich O'Reilly here.
Hi. I have a question about the future of the Republicans. If Mitt Romney loses, let's project a scenario where Romney loses, maybe the Democrats gain a seat in the Senate, maybe the Republicans lose 5 or 10 seats in the House. Okay, it's not a catastrophic landslide. Does the Republican Party begin to splinter? Do the moderates finally say, I can't continue to exist in this organization? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How would you speculate on that issue?
I have trouble seeing that scenario because if the moderates, first of all, I'm not sure how many moderates, especially in the House, are even left. But if they come to that conclusion, I think they're committing political suicide. They can't say, okay, I'm done with the conservatives. I'm going to survive on my own now. I'm going to be a moderate because I come from, say I'm from Illinois and it's a blue state and my district is favorable to Democrats and it kind of likes Obama. And from now on, I'm going to cooperate with Obama and that's going to be my way forward. I think the problem is, and we saw this in 2010 and we saw this again this year, even in blue states, even in Democratic-friendly areas, this sort of purity minded Republican base is punishing people like that, people who do a fraction of that. Again, I come back to like Mike Castle losing that primary to Christine O'Donnell in Delaware. I mean, he didn't lose to an ambitious 6-term conservative congressman who ran or congresswoman who ran a great campaign and had all sorts of grassroots money. I mean, he lost literally to a random person who had her name on the ballot. And then we found out all this stuff about after. I mean, when that is happening, I cannot see how, especially in the wake of say a Mitt Romney loss, if the party is drawing the lesson that where we are right now, when we're nominating Christine O'Donnell for Senate races, when we're nominating Richard Murdoch for Senate races, that this isn't conservative enough. I can't see moderates having any room to go off on their own in a party like that. I mean, of course, the thing I always remember is, as I said earlier, the Republicans were just as rough in a lot of ways on Clinton as they've been on Obama, just as unyielding in their opposition for much of the first term. They had the '94 landslide and everything. And when Clinton got reelected in '96, yes, they did impeach him, but they did. They were willing to work with him a little bit more in his second term. My theory is that they really felt in the '90s that Clinton had beaten them. He beat them on the government shutdown with Newt Gingrich in 1995. He beat them in the 1996 election. I think the conclusion, if Obama gets reelected, that they take is not, yeah, Obama beat us, it's we lost it. And I think that has a much different effect.
Okay, over there.
I just wanted to find out your opinion on Candy Crowley the other night, whether or not it was appropriate for her to do a fact check on the Benghazi question.
Right. Yeah, here's the thing, like especially listening to her comments about it afterwards, I think I know what happened there. And to Obama supporters, it looked like, I mean, it was a very bad moment for Mitt Romney. There's no getting around it. It looked like she was calling out Mitt Romney. I think what she was actually trying to do there, in her mind, wasn't fact-check Mitt Romney as much as it was move the conversation forward. Because if you notice the way she worded that, this part nobody focused on. She corrected Romney on, yes, actually look at the transcript. This is what Obama said in the Rose Garden. But then she said, but you, sir, are correct on that it took 2 weeks.
But the audience was applauding over the second half of that.
And so I think it came across differently than she intended it. And I think what she was doing was absolutely the duty of a moderator, and that's, they're now, you have these two candidates standing in front of you arguing over, you said this, and no, I didn't say this, and you have a person there who happens to know what was said, and so she introduced that, I think in her mind, not in a way to sort of show up one of the candidates or anything, just as a way to move the discussion forward. And in that sense, I think if Romney came up looking bad there, that's his fault at that point because he shouldn't have made the claim. But I think the whole issue of real-time fact-checking by moderators, I have mixed feelings about it because I think a lot of times we have this problem with fact-checkers now in the media. Every newspaper now has a fact-checker, and all these organizations have fact-checkers, and you find out their interpretations become subjective too, to a certain degree. We can't even agree sometimes on is this a fact that's even testable? Is this right. Something that can So I when you go down that road, I think it gets really slippery really quickly. But what she actually did, I don't think there was a problem with it at all. And I thought, just one quick thought, and I love Jim Lehrer and PBS, and Bob Schieffer's is really good and everything. But the commission that runs these presidential debates, I think, can be a little old, a little stodgy, and they lean on the familiar. So Jim Lehrer has moderated 728 presidential debates now, and they've got Bob Schieffer coming on Monday night. And you know what? They tried something a little different on 2 other occasions this year: Martha Raddatz and Candy Crowley. And I think Martha Raddatz and Candy Crowley it was refreshing. It was much better than Lehrer did this year. And I think than Lehrer's done in the past. It's better than a guy like Schieffer. And I wish they would open it up more like that in the future. I hope they take this as a lesson of like, you know what, we can let some different people in here, and it actually might be a good thing.
Although if we go back to '92, and you and I have actually correspondent about all these old debates that are being shown on C-SPAN. Those of you who have had a chance to watch it, I mean, it really is, it's just fascinating to watch. And my favorite debate of all time is the '92 town hall, because that was as substantive as debates get, but it was, the tone was good from all three candidates. Remember, Ross Perot was involved in that as well. Carol Simpson, I thought, did probably one of the best jobs that a moderator's ever done, particularly in that format. And unfortunately, you know, we don't have Carol Simpsons around anymore,
Right.
I don't think, and as well as, I don't think we have the candidates behaving the same way.
I was going to say, you also don't have is Bill Clinton. Because if there was ever a candidate made for the town hall setting, it was Bill Clinton, and it was whatever you think of him, you know. But I just watching him perform in that setting, it's like a master at work, you know.
Right. I mean, yeah, that part is true. But even if you take, if you put aside George Bush looking at his watch, and he was fine in that forum, as was Ross Perot, and they were fine with each other in terms of disagreeing with each other.
Right.
And what's happened? Why don't we see that anymore?
Yeah, well, I think it felt to me on Tuesday, it was Tuesday night, right? It felt to me on Tuesday night like the audience, I forgot about the audience a lot of times in that debate. And I've never seen in that setting, the only, you can think back to 2000 when it was Bush versus Gore, and you had that moment when Gore approached Bush while he was speaking, and Bush looks at him and gives him this weird nod, and that was the closest I've seen to that kind of interaction between the candidates. Otherwise, they always keep their distance and they sit in their stools, and except McCain, who wandered around the stage aimlessly in 2008. But that was the first time. To me, this was my second favorite of the town hall, debates that we've seen. I agree with you on the '92 one. But it was a completely different dynamic. It was just much more about the friction between the candidates.
This was the best debate for political junkies.
Right.
Now, for the voter,
Right.
It's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no, and I think what came through that. Well, I'm not necessarily on that, because I think there can be some value, I think, in watching as direct interaction and confrontation between the two candidates as we had this week, and we don't get that much. I hate when they, it actually became pretty animated, but I generally hate when they have the round table and they sit them at the table, and I'm sort of like, Phil Donahue actually.
Maybe we should put them in a room without a moderator or an audience.
This is what I was just going to say. I did a story on
just
this
a surveillance
for Salon.
camera.
Phil Donahue, the old TV guy, always had the vision of a moderatorless debate, and empty out the studio. Give them each a glass of water and give them an hour and a half. And it's completely organic. They have to decide what issues they raise, how they raise them. There's no time limits, there's no rules whatsoever. And just see what kind of conversation these guys create. And you'll learn things you don't even expect to learn about them in a setting like that. Just watching them interact with each other as human beings. And it is one needlessly hostile, it's one filibuster, whatever it is. And Donahue managed to get one moderatorless debate on his show. It was in 1992. It was in the Democratic primaries that year. It was Bill Clinton versus Jerry Brown. They're both running for the Democratic nomination. In the New York primary was coming up, and Donahue gave them an hour on his show. And it's on C-SPAN. I went and dug the tape out. The studio is empty, and Donahue said, "Governor Brown, Governor Clinton, the floor is yours." And that's it. And Donahue didn't say anything else. And I have to say it was a huge disappointment, because he says that, and then they kind of look at each other, and Brown goes, well, it's good to be here. And then they spent an hour basically complimenting. They had been tearing each other apart on that campaign trail. They spent an hour complimenting each other and singing the praises of the Democratic Party. When I interviewed Donahue about it, I said, so that kind of proves it doesn't work. He said, no, that proves that it doesn't work in a primary.
Right. Because
in the primary, they're going to be there's a certain incentive to not to talk up the party, blah blah blah. And if you do it in a general election, it's much different. And so I'd like to see that. And we never will, but we can talk about
We have another question over there.
We have Dan Roman, who is a sophomore in the political science department at Monmouth University.
Yes. Hi, I was just wondering what you think President Obama and the Democrats have to do to gain back ground on the message of the economy.
Honestly, like I was saying to up here, the last obvious opportunity for it was this debate this week. You had 80% of it at least focused on domestic issues. You're going to have next week's debate, and maybe there's a way to work the economy into that. Maybe Romney, who who I think would rather be talking about the economy and domestic issues, will try to bring it up, and I think there'll be some openings there for Obama. But I think that the things that have worked for Obama on the economy, that have helped him this year in general, one, and I don't know how he can say this necessarily, but one is that people remember what he inherited. You still look at polls and ask people who is more responsible for the current economic conditions. You give them a choice, they're going to say, a lot more are going to say George W. Bush than Barack Obama. Still, end of the first term, that still applies. I think that's helped Obama retain popularity that an incumbent with these economic numbers would have lost in another situation. So I think there's that. I think there's the idea that you can kind of tie into that, and he did this a little bit the other night, which is, which is about, well, okay, you remember who got us into this mess, and you remember what those policies were, and Vin was saying this earlier, and is there any difference between what Mitt Romney is proposing and what George W. Bush did? And that, to me, was the second worst moment for Romney at the debate the other night, the first being Libya, but the second worst was when a voter got up and asked him, said, I am concerned that you will be no different than George W. Bush. Can you calm my fears? And he at first seemed to be trying to duck the question, and then he responded by talking about, I think, trade with China, no Obamacare, and saying he wouldn't, just asserting that he wouldn't raise the deficit, he would fight the deficit. But if you look at his tax plan, it's the same basic framework that Bush used. So I think he's very vulnerable on questions like that. On this study that came out the other day that said the 12 million jobs promise doesn't really add up. I think those are the areas that Obama needs to be focusing on, and then also it's tough to do it, but convincing people that there has been significant progress, not sufficient progress, but significant progress. Bill Clinton did a great job of that at the Democratic Convention with the message that he used there. I'm not so sure that Obama, for instance, Obama at the debate the other night talks about, in a different question about, there's a voter who said, I voted for you in 2008, and I'm not sure I can do it again this year. Can you tell me what you've done to warrant re-election? And Obama ticks off a bunch of his accomplishments. And one of the first ones is, well, I said I would cut middle-class taxes, and I did. And it's true, he did. But there's polling on this. Nobody knows he did. Nobody knows he did that. No, it was in the stimulus. Yeah. Nobody knows it, and nobody believes it. So him standing up there, I think he is unwittingly reinforcing the perception that he's been an underwhelming president when he gets up there and says that, because I think that sounds, I think most people hear that and probably say, what tax cut? Because they do not know about it. They do not believe they got it.
Yeah, that's true. Just looking at polling that I've been doing since the beginning of his administration, one of the questions that I would ask early on was give him a list of groups of people and say, do Obama's policies benefit this group? And it would be the wealthy, the poor, the middle class, businesses, Wall Street, healthcare, whatever it was. Middle class was always at the bottom of that list. It was below the poor, it was below the wealthy. In terms of what the perceptions were, what his policies were. And that's what gets back to what we were talking about with the blame, about who's to blame for it. And that's what I was finding in this combination of polling at the end of September. This was why Obama had a 3 to 4 point lead in the polls at the end of September, which was, we're not convinced that what he's done is the best that he could have done. Necessarily, or the greatest, or that he was really concerned or focused on the middle class, but he was handed a mess. And we're not comfortable with the other guy. It was that combination of things. He never won people on that economic argument.
Right.
It was that he won it in a part in comparison to a discomfort with Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney being worse for the middle class than Obama. But Obama wasn't good for the middle class.
Right.
So that first debate changed that.
Romney.
Now Romney, Romney might not be bad for the middle class, and Obama wasn't great for the middle class. That reinforced something that people, I think, were shoving aside. That sense of discomfort that Obama really didn't have the middle class forefront, wouldn't have it in the 4 years. I think people were putting it aside simply because of the discomfort with Mitt Romney, which gets back to, Dan, your question. I think he can't win that argument.
Right.
It's gone. I mean, he only was winning it by default.
If the knock on him of you haven't given us a good second-term agenda, but it's almost like if you do that, you'd say, well, why didn't you do that in the first term? And I think it sounds, and that's why I thought, just my little armchair quarterbacking, I just thought he should be making the jobs bill that he put forward last year, the second stimulus, something that he's running on now, because he can tie in, like, it adds context to why more wasn't done in the first term, and it creates something to look forward to the second term, and it makes the election a referendum, at least attempts to make the election a referendum on that.
Right, yeah, I think the issue now is that we're not going to see a national message anymore. This
Right.
message, and the jobs message is going to play in Ohio and Wisconsin. That's where and Iowa. This is where they're going to play that message. Well, not Iowa as much, because they don't have the job
Right.
situation as Wisconsin and Ohio have. So it's going to be these targeted messages, targeted to get out the vote now, than that national message.
And just one, and the other quick thing just is, so we talked about this fiscal cliff that's coming at the end of the year, and the decision on the Bush tax cuts. They're set to expire, and it's been more than 20 years since a single Republican in Congress has voted for tax increase. I think one of the promises, Obama adamantly does not want to extend these things. He can let them expire by doing nothing, but there's all sorts of consequences there. One of the promises of this campaign for Obama initially, I think, was to run on that message of we're not letting the Bush tax cuts go forward for the top 2%. And he says, to his credit, he says that a fair amount. But I don't think if he gets reelected, I think the hope for Obama was that if he gets reelected, that message gets delivered to Republicans in Congress, that this is a big reason they lost, and this is something they need to reconsider a little bit. And that would not happen at this point, I don't think.
I think we got time for one or two more questions. We have one over here.
My name is Christine Gabriel, and I am I'm studying my master's in education here. You had said that if Governor Romney wins, he would have to have a very conservative presidency. What do you think that holds for the popular debate of education?
I think it's fairly simple. I think, limited federal role. I don't think there'd be, there certainly would be any increases in student aid and Pell Grants and that kind of thing. I think there'd probably be cuts there. The one thing that I would be interested in seeing, and he has not addressed that much, is race to the top, which is, there's that divide in the Democratic Party where there's a lot of voices in the Democratic Party. They're critical of the teachers' unions. Then there's sort of the more pro-union side, and Obama, with the Race to the Top program, sided with the critics of the teachers' unions a little bit. Romney has this basically blanket policy of not giving Obama credit for anything ever, but I'd suspect that's something in some form that would be continued, where they set these standards, from Washington, and let states, or in some cases now maybe even individual districts, compete for federal funding. Obviously, there's a lot of conservative roots in an idea like that, and I suspect that might be something that.
Do you think there's going to be a sea change in education policy with a?
Well, it's just part of that broader, block grant things. Send federal programs back to the states. I can't. Besides defense, I can't see anything that they would. That they'd be looking to increase, at the federal level.
Yeah, to me, I mean, in the second debate, it almost sounded like Mitt Romney was proposing a college scholarship program, although I think he was proposing it as being privately funded,
right.
Which he didn't say.
He had a comment, take it for what it's worth, but he had a comment where he talked about, you want to go to college, borrow from your parents. I'm not going to. I'm not going to. Don't look to me.
But he mentioned some program in Massachusetts,
right.
For the top 20%.
Well, and there's
right,
the John and Abigail Adams, and it sounds like it's classic Romney, because it's a reasonable sounding outcome, and he asserts, he talks about this outcome that sounds great to everybody, but if you look at Paul Ryan's budget, there's very little room in there for Pell Grants, Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question, right over here.
Good evening. Scott Crass, proud alumnus. Welcome, Steve. First of all, just one quick comment. To lend credence to what you had said before about the Democrats not really, the president in particular, not articulating many of their proposals on jobs, and the fact that the Republicans have blocked it. At the convention, the only person that I heard talking about the American Jobs Act was Bill Clinton. He was the only speaker who mentioned that. But as far as my question, though, I had a unique perspective. And as you know, Steve, you and I communicate on Twitter occasionally. I have many unique perspectives and thoughts. But I'm wondering if this election might, in a sense, be the Kennedy-Goldwater election that we never got, We had a president who came into office by very unique historic circumstances. And while, of course, Romney is not as conservative as Barry Goldwater, what you had said before about a Romney presidency wouldn't so much be about Romney, it would be about the Republican Party, which, of course, is probably beyond conservative that Goldwater is. You know, that I kind of wonder, they were going to go at it philosophically had JFK and Goldwater had he lived. We never got that chance. And I'm wondering if 48 years later, I guess, this is one of the elections, JFK Goldwater, what it would have been like.
Yeah, I never thought of that, and that's a really good point. We look back at 1964, and it's an epic landslide, LBJ over Goldwater, and Goldwater has Arizona and a few southern states, and he's getting 30% in the north, an absolute landslide. We forget that, I think it was about a month before Kennedy was killed in fall '63, pretty sure it was a Time magazine cover, might have been Newsweek if it was around, I'm pretty sure it was Time, actually put on its cover an electoral map for 1964 with a Goldwater victory scenario, Goldwater over Kennedy. And you had civil rights, obviously the issues were much different back then, civil rights being at the fore of the national debate. But you had this dynamic where Kennedy came in, I think if you look at the sort of base of support that Kennedy had, in a lot of ways, it's similar to Obama's. I think he represented something similar in his time to what Obama represents in our time. And I think it triggered a very similar backlash that was particularly pronounced in the South, it's particularly pronounced in rural areas.
Although he had a 60% job approval rating.
I was getting to that. The one difference is the economy was in much better shape in 1963 and 1964. So I would say it would be the same if the economy was a little worse back then. But that's an interesting thought.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for coming. Thanks, Steve Kornacki, for taking time out of his busy schedule to be here. Hopefully we'll be doing more of this, and so hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.